Hey friends, and welcome to D&D Daily. Today I'm doing a Cleric subclass deep dive with the War Domain Cleric. In this video I'm going to discuss its features, its strengths and weaknesses, and I usually do a build, but I'm actually just going to reference you to one of the other builds that I've done. Before getting started, I like to talk about how when I do these subclass breakdowns, I like to take what's unique about the subclass and do my builds around that. Even if it's weaker than what the base class can do on its own or what other subclasses can do, I like to find what's unique and really explore it. And try and make it as good as I can, right? And this is definitely going to be one of those builds. But without further ado, let's jump into the War Domain Cleric. At level 1, we get martial weapons, heavy armor proficiency, the War Priest feature, as well as the Divine Favor and Shield of Faith spells. The bonus proficiencies that we get, the heavy weapons and the better armor, ultimately equals a +1 to AC and the option to go with a strength-based build. Now I think it's interesting talking about these clerics who get these heavy weapons, who get the martial weapons. How much better is it than a normal cleric? Well, if we're talking about optimization, and that's all we're talking about right now, it's going to be hard to beat a shield with whatever weapon and spiritual guardians. That whatever weapon is often a rapier, because it's a D8, instead of being like a D6 that you would get with a simple weapon. So basically it's a +1 damage to every attack. And you might be saying, well, why don't we go with the heavy weapons? Well, we lose the shield with the heavy weapons. For a little bit of extra damage, we increase the risk of us losing our concentration. And our concentration is a much bigger deal than a little bit of extra damage because our concentration represents spiritual guardians, which acts as crazy amounts of damage and control. Like if we're talking about pure efficiency, almost all clerics are just going to appreciate a shield more than they are the heavy weapons, and they'll appreciate the heavy armor for its +1 AC. But something I've kind of learned through this video, and I'll touch more on this later in a different video, but something I've learned through doing all these cleric subclass breakdowns is that I underestimated how good a medium armor melee cleric could be. You throw on half plate with a shield, you have 19 AC, that's plenty to just get in there and turn on your spiritual guardians, take the dodge action if you need, if your weapon's not good enough to be doing a ton of damage. But all that being said, we do have the flexibility to use our martial weapons and use heavy armor. So we have all the flexibility to be strength builds, ranged builds, melee builds, dexterity builds. We have a lot of flexibility, and that really comes from these bonus proficiencies. Our War Priest feature allows us to make a bonus action attack a couple of times per day. Now this bonus action attack is absolutely fantastic at levels 1 through 4, and then kind of falls off at levels 5 and beyond because all the other martials are getting extra attack. But we're one of the few people who can achieve a multi-attack this early in the game. Without taking feats, that is. And from levels 5 to 7 is probably its lowest point. At level 8, we pick up either Blessed or Divine Strikes, and this can have a niche trying to make sure that we proc that effect every turn. So, because if we miss an attack, we don't get to proc our Blessed Strike. Now we get another chance to try and proc that extra D8 or 2D8 of damage. Now a niche use case for the War Domain Cleric is actually how well it works with heavy crossbows. Heavy crossbows have the loading property, which makes them inefficient for any class that has multi-attack. But with the War Domain Cleric, the bonus action attack still works with the loading property. So we basically have a multi-attack with a heavy crossbow a couple times a day, which is something most people can't pull off. So there's an interesting little niche for us to explore there. Moving into our spells, Divine Favor acts as a low-level offensive boost, similar to, Hunter's Mark or Hex. It gets better the more attacks we make, and that's something we're never going to do a lot of. It's kind of interesting. I feel like this class was designed to be someone who attacks a lot, but they didn't give them the tools to do it. I think they needed to give them a multi-attack at level 6. Along with the bonus action attack to really make them feel more martial. Sword Singers get that, the Swords Bard gets it, so it's interesting that we don't. And I think that's kind of something I would actually allow. So I usually don't talk about homebrew in these sections, but if I have someone playing a War Priest, I would allow them to exchange their level 6 feature for the extra attack feature. I think that would go a long way to making the subclass fit its niche better. But I digress. Moving on to the second first level spell we get Shield of Faith. Shield of Faith is a very mediocre low-level defensive option. It's a first level spell to give someone a +2 AC. Its highest expense, though, is that it takes our concentration, and we're just going to have too many important things to concentrate on, including level 1 we have Blessed to concentrate on. So it just gets outshined, and if it didn't take concentration, it'd be really fantastic, but it does, so it's at where it's at. You know, the concentration is the real issue with both of our first level spells. We're not going to be able to take a lot of advantage of them because they both cost concentration and are competing with better spells that only get better as we level up. At level 2, we get our Channel Divinity Guided Strike, which gives us a +10 to hit after we roll, but before we know if it hits or not. This has a ton of synergy with Sharpshooter and Great Weapons Mastery, so a lot of builds you'll see built around that, although I would really say take that with a grain of salt. The Great Weapon Master is only going to get multi-attack a couple times a day, so a Marshal with Great Weapon Master is just naturally going to be doing it way more often and taking advantage of it way more often. So I don't think it's as good as people make it out to be. Really, we're like guaranteeing one hit, which isn't that amazing at the end of the day. It really isn't. And I think you get basically just as much value, if not more, using attack-based spells like Inflict Wounds or Guiding Bolt, and then using your +10 for that. So again, it's trying to make you an awesome weapons user, but it's just falling short for me. And it's kind of funny because the build I'm going to reference you to uses Sharpshooter, so I'm kind of being a hypocrite. But in general, I would actually, you know, talking again about optimization, I don't think you're going to find it with Sharpshooter and Great Weapons Master, even though that's most of the builds you're going to find on War Priest, so it is what it is. At level 3, we pick up Magic Weapon and Spiritual Weapon. Spiritual Weapon, if you guys don't know at this point, is going to be a staple for Cleric's damage output. It's a concentration-less, consistent damage output for a bonus action, which we're going to have to use more often than not. Magic Weapon has a niche that when we're fighting someone who has resistance to magic weapons, we want to put it on our best Marshal, even if that's ourselves, so that they don't have resistance to our damage. At level 5, we pick up Crusader's Mantle and Spiritual Guardians. If you guys don't know, Spiritual Guardians is a crazy spell and is a big reason why this class is optimized, is still just going to be a Spirit Guardians cleric, which is like every cleric. Every cleric can get by on the back of Spirit Guardians. It's just that good. But it's always fun to, you know, switch it up and try different things, which again, my build is going to do. But keep in mind that if you're going for optimization with a cleric, often it's going to be put on your best armor, put on a shield, and go use Spiritual Guardians to get close to people. Then there's Crusader's Mantle, which is pretty interesting. So we create this area around us of 30 feet. Until the spell ends, the aura moves with us, centered on us. While in the aura, each non-hostile creature in the area, including ourselves, deals an extra 1d4 of radiant damage when it hits with a weapon attack. So it basically gives kind of a less good hunter's mark to everyone within 30 feet of us. So if we have like a multi-attacking party, this could actually be pretty sick. You know, a lot of marshals in one party. You should really consider doing a whole party build around this. I love it. I think it's kind of a cool concept. I love the idea of, you know, rangers with hunter's marks getting their 3 attacks, you know, using 2 weapons or whatever, their crossbow expert. You know, the fighter doing a bunch with action surge and just piling on all these attacks and just rolling tons of d4 and having a whole party built around it. I love the idea. Whether or not it's going to be put in practice, I think it'll be rarely useful, but when it is useful, I think it's pretty cool. I'd actually love to do a build around Crusader's Mantle. At level 6, we get our Channel Divinity Ward God's Blessing. This Channel Divinity gives the exact same thing as our other Channel Divinity, except we can do it for our allies. Now we have to consider whose attacks are the most impactful and need to absolutely hit. You know, someone like the Rogue with Sneak Attack is an obvious choice that they need to hit, or they're not going to get that pile of d6s rolled. But there's other ones like the Ancestral Guardian's Barbarian really needs to hit to get off that defensive debuff, and we can really help make that happen. So this is hard to evaluate until you know what your party is. Once you know who your party is, you can evaluate and decide who it's best used on. Worst case scenario, you can always use it, you know, continue using the Channel Divinities on yourself or to get extra spell slots. At level 7, we get Freedom of Movement and Stone Skin. I think Freedom of Movement is actually a fairly underrated spell. It's a great spell to have in your back pocket against certain enemies, and these certain enemies come up quite often. Any enemy that like attacks you and it both grapples and restrains you, which are a ton of enemies, this is going to be a really good counter towards them and a reactive counter to them. Paralyze is a devastating effect, so having a counter to it is also amazing. So I really do like having this in our back pocket as a when needed spell. And you know, you might be comparing it to like Greater Restoration that can also cure paralysis. and it's not as universally good as Greater Restoration, but it does have niches where it's going to shine. Namely, it's a lower level spell slot. It doesn't take any components. It doesn't expend any components to use. And it has kind of a continual effect afterwards, not just a one-time. Stone Skin, on the other hand, gives us resistance to non-magical bludgeoning, slashing, and piercing damage. It's pretty good, but it's a little awkward because when it's coming into effect, we're also rolling concentration checks for it. So it kind of has an anti-synergy that the only time it's useful is when you're taking damage. And when you're taking damage, you're rolling concentration saves, which can make you lose it. So it kind of has this weird loop of not working great. And I think even more than that, just the concentration cost is so high. Concentration is just amazing. And so using your concentration to protect just you when you could be using your concentration to win the fight seems like just too steep of a price to get a lot of use out of this. And then this becomes completely useless at level 17 when we just get this feature naturally. At level 8, we get to choose between either Blessed or Divine Strikes, and the rule of thumb is always go Blessed Strikes, and this is no exception. In fact, it's even less of an exception than other times because our Divine Strikes don't do magical damage, whereas Radiant damage is magical damage. So right off the bat, Blessed Strikes just takes it far and away. Now again, I ignore my own advice when I do the cleric build that I'm going to reference you to later, but what are you going to do? At level 9, we pick up our spells Flame Strike and Hold Monster. Flame Strike is a bad fireball, but a bad fireball is better than no fireball, so we actually do kind of have an AoE blasting option. It is just like, I can't talk about Flame Strike with just talking about how bizarre it is, because it is 2 levels more expensive than Fireball and just worse in basically every single way. Less area, less damage. But I do think there is a niche for like Radiant and Fire damage being mixed together to kind of find people's weaknesses, you know, what do they struggle against. Hold Monster can be powerful, but it does have quite a bit holding it back. It targets 1 creature. It allows saves every single turn, including before it takes effect. And so it really targets these like single big bad monsters, but those monsters often have legendary resistance, and that's going to be a pretty pricey spell to have just negated by a legendary resistance. So I think it struggles. I think the spell struggles, but there are going to be moments where it just absolutely wins you a fight, and that's just off the back of that Paralyze is one hell of a condition. At level 17, the capstone feature for this subclass, we get the Avatar of Battle. We have resistance to non-magical bludgeoning, slashing, and piercing damage. This is kind of interesting because the War Domain Cleric gets the exact same thing at the exact same level, except they get immunity to fire on top of it. So we're just kind of outshone here. That being said, those resistances are always fantastic. It doesn't matter what level of the campaign you're in. Those resistances will always come into play. What is the conclusion on the War Domain Cleric? It really wants to be a martial Gish. It really wants to use weapons more than any other cleric does. But the thing is if you take a great sword and you take great weapons master and you take your heavy armor and you run in there, it's not going to be as effective as a shield, whatever armor they had, a simple weapon and spiritual guardians running in there. So it's like, why would you take great weapons master when you can take warcaster, which keeps your spiritual guardians up better? And that's what a normal cleric does. So it kind of feels like what's best here is what the normal cleric does, and then there's this subclass that kind of pushes you to do something less effective. But here's the thing, clerics are so good and that they can afford to go do a different playstyle because it's fun and to still be a completely viable build. So you can kind of take whatever cleric you want for whatever reasons you want and still be good. And I feel like War Domain really falls into that. No, it's not the most effective cleric, but it does have that focus on weapons. And if you want that from your cleric, take it, man. Take War Domain Cleric and make it work, because it will work. Levels 1 through 4 are going to feel fantastic because you're the only person doing extra attack besides anyone who's taken a feat to do it, you know, those variant humans, you know, or druid who's wild shaping into a bear. But that being said, is that they don't get sharpshooter with it. They're not dropping those plus 10 damages with the multi-attack like you can. So you are a really fantastic martial, levels 1 through 4. At levels 5 and above, you fall off. You're not going to be as good of a martial as everyone else, and you're kind of more of a martial support with some of your own unique martial prowesses. But at the end of the day, you're going to be more of a spellcaster. I wouldn't be surprised if you fall into the Spiritual Guardians, heavy armor, shield, you know, whatever sword you want type niche. But there's some other ones to play with, and I want to explore another one of those with my character build. So instead of doing the build here, I'm going to reference you to the Heavy Cross Bow Cleric. This is a build I'm actually quite proud of and I'm excited for you all to see, so please check it out. We are D&D Daily. We release new D&D content every single day, so if that's interesting to you, hit the subscribe button, and I'll see you on the next one. Peace.